They called her his brother's wife. Not a director. Not a founder. Not a woman who had sat beside the company through every difficult year of its life. Just his brother's wife, a category they had already decided came with boundaries. She let them believe that right up until the moment she placed a recorder on a mahogany boardroom table and pressed play. Before we begin, remember this. While the story you're about to hear is fictional, the message behind it is very real. At Zara Tales, we believe the right story at the right moment can change a life. The rains came early to Port Harcourt that year. They arrived in March instead of April, heavy and without warning, the kind of rains that flooded the low roads and turned the red earth dark. Adaeze Briggs stood at the window of the bedroom she had shared with her husband for 31 years and watched the water collect in the compound below. The generator hummed somewhere behind the house. The gateman had already swept the entrance twice that morning, but the water kept coming. Chitty Briggs had died 11 days ago. Adaeze was 63 years old. She had married Chitty when she was 32 and he was 38, both of them considered too old for a first marriage by the standards of the world they moved in. People had said it would not last. People had said Chitty's family would never fully accept a woman who came with no connections, no father in business, no name that opened doors. People had said many things. Adaeze had learned early that people talked most loudly about the futures they could not see. The marriage had lasted 31 years. It had produced 2 children, a son named Obinna who now lived in London, and a daughter named Amara who was finishing her medical residency in Abuja. It had also produced Briggs Energy Services, a company Chitty had built from one leased office in Remulla and a second-hand truck into one of the most respected indigenous oil services firms in the Niger Delta. Adaeze had been there for all of it. She had signed documents when his hands were full. She had entertained clients when he was too tired to perform warmth. She had sat across from bankers and spoken clearly when doubt entered the room. She had never been listed on the company letterhead. That was simply how things were done in those days. But the company carried her fingerprints on every floor. Now Chitty was gone. And the fingerprints were all that remained to prove it. She turned from the window when she heard the knock. It was Mama Benson, the housekeeper who had lived in the boys' quarters at the back of the compound for 18 years. Mama Benson was a small, round woman with gray at her temples and the particular stillness of someone who had survived enough of other people's storms to know when another one was gathering. She entered carrying a tray, hot tea, sliced pawpaw, 2 slices of bread. She placed it on the side table without speaking and began to straighten the room with quiet efficiency. Adaeze watched her. "You do not have to do that," she said. Mama Benson did not stop folding. "Somebody has to." Adaeze almost smiled. That was the thing about Mama Benson. She did not offer comfort in words. She offered it in motion. In food that appeared before you realized you were hungry. In rooms that were tidied before the disorder could settle into grief. "Has anyone called?" Adaeze asked. Mama Benson paused for only a moment. "His brother called. Chief Festus. He said he would come this afternoon." Adaeze's expression did not change. She picked up the tea. "What time?" 3 o'clock, Mama Benson said. "He is bringing his lawyer." Adaeze set the cup down slowly. "His lawyer?" "Yes, Ma." The 2 women looked at each other. 18 years of shared mornings had given them a language that did not require sentences. Mama Benson's eyes said what her mouth did not, "Be careful." Adaeze said what her face would not show, "I know." Chief Festus Briggs was Chitty's older brother by 4 years. He was a large man, both in body and in the space he believed he occupied in any room. He had spent 30 years building his own business empire in Port Harcourt, construction contracts, logistics, a small hotel in GRA, and had spent nearly as long resenting the fact that Chitty's quieter, steadier company had somehow grown larger and more respected than all of it combined. When Chitty was alive, Festus had kept his resentment mostly beneath the surface. He came to Christmas. He toasted at family gatherings. He clapped Chitty on the shoulder and called him brother in the loud way of men performing affection for an audience. But in private, in the small moments that fell between the performances, Festus had always made one thing clear. He did not believe Adaeze deserved what she had. "She is a nobody," he had said once, years ago, to a cousin who had repeated it to Adaeze through the winding telephone of family gossip. Chitty could have married better. Could have married someone who brought something to the table. Instead he chose a woman with nothing but her face and her stubbornness. Adaeze had filed that sentence away without responding to it. She had learned that some battles were won not by fighting but by outlasting. She had outlasted Festus's contempt for 31 years. She intended to outlast whatever he was bringing through her gate this afternoon. She drank her tea and ate her bread and watched the rain begin to ease over the compound. Then she went downstairs to prepare herself. Chief Festus arrived at 3:15, which told Adaeze immediately that he wanted her to feel the weight. He came in a black Mercedes with tinted windows, flanked by two men. One was a driver, the other was clearly the lawyer, a young man in a navy suit carrying a leather briefcase with the careful expression of someone hired to be useful but not prominent. Festus himself stepped out wearing a grey agbada and the kind of leather shoes that made a statement on marble floors. He had gained weight since the burial. Or perhaps grief simply made some people look smaller and others look larger. Adaeze stood at the entrance of the sitting room and watched him come in. "Festus," she said. "Ada," he replied. He did not call her sister. He never had. They sat in the large sitting room, the room Chitty had loved most, with its tall windows overlooking the garden and the framed photographs on the west wall. Chitty at the company's 10th anniversary. Chitty and Adaeze at Obina's graduation. Chitty receiving an award from the state governor. Festus glanced at the photographs and looked away as if they were a minor irritant. The lawyer opened his briefcase. Festus did not introduce him. Adaeze noted that. "I will come straight to the point," Festus said. His voice carried the easy authority of a man who believed rooms belonged to him simply because he had entered them. "The company cannot be left in this condition. Chitty is gone. The board needs leadership. The clients need reassurance. The staff need direction." Adaeze folded her hands in her lap. "I am aware of what the company needs," she said evenly. Festus looked at her with the particular patience of someone managing a misunderstanding. "Ada, this is not the time for sentiment. This company is worth too much to be left in uncertain hands." "Whose hands are you proposing?" she asked. Festus leaned back slightly. "There are people within the family who understand this industry. Who have the relationships, the experience, the standing to carry this forward." "You mean yourself?" Festus did not blink. "I mean people who are equipped." Adaeze looked at the lawyer. The young man's eyes were on his folder. She returned her gaze to Festus. "The will has not been read," she said. "The probate process has not concluded. My husband has been buried 11 days. And you have come here with a lawyer." Festus spread his hands. "I am here to protect the family's interests." "I am his family," Adaeze said quietly. The room went still. Outside, a car passed on the road beyond the gate. The generator hummed its steady note. Festus looked at Adaeze with an expression that had lived behind his courtesy for 3 decades and was now simply present, unguarded, certain of itself. "You were his wife," he said. "That is not the same thing." Adaeze held his gaze without blinking. She had known this moment was coming. She had felt it the day after the burial when Festus's wife had pulled her sister-in-law aside at the reception and whispered careful questions about the company structure. She had felt it when Chitty's cousins had gathered in the corridor during the funeral and fallen silent when she walked past. She had felt it every time family wealth changed hands in this part of the world and the wife discovered she had been standing on land that was never truly hers. But she was not afraid. Not yet. Because there was something Festus did not know. Something that had been sitting in the bottom drawer of Chitty's old desk for 7 years, recorded without purpose, preserved without plan, waiting in the dark like a truth that had decided not to hurry. The lawyer began to speak. He explained that certain shareholders within the company, minority shareholders, but organized, had raised concerns about the direction of Briggs Energy Services following the founder's passing. He used words like succession planning and governance structure and interim leadership. He spoke carefully and without malice, the way lawyers did when they were delivering someone else's intentions in acceptable packaging. Adaeze listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not show alarm. She asked 2 questions when he finished, both procedural, both calm, and then she stood and told Festus that she appreciated him coming and that she would consult her own counsel before responding further. Festus looked surprised. Not at the answer but at the composure behind it. He had expected something else. Tears, perhaps. Or pleading. Or the particular vulnerability of a woman who had spent 31 years as the person behind the person and had not thought to build anything in her own name. He did not know Adaeze Briggs. After they left, Mama Benson appeared in the doorway of the sitting room with a glass of cold water. Adaeze took it and drank half of it before speaking. "He wants the company," Adaeze said. Mama Benson sat down across from her without being invited, which was the privilege of 18 years. "He has always wanted it," she said. "He was just waiting for Olga to leave." Adaeze set the glass down. "I need to make some calls." Mama Benson nodded. "Eat first." Adaeze almost said there was no time. Then she looked at Mama Benson's face and understood that the woman was not talking about food. She was talking about strength. About not walking into a war on an empty foundation. Adaeze nodded once and went to the kitchen. That evening, she called Obinna in London. The call lasted 40 minutes. Her son was quiet in the way of men who were trying not to show fear. He had heard the rumors already. A cousin had sent a message on a family group chat, vague enough to be deniable but pointed enough to be a warning. Obinna said he would come home. Adaeze told him to wait. She needed him positioned where he was for now. She needed him calm. She called Amara next. Her daughter cried, then stopped crying, then asked in a voice made of steel, "What do we do?" Adaeze told her. Amara said she understood. She also said she was coming home regardless, and on this point Adaeze did not argue. Then Adaeze went to Chitty's study. The study was the one room in the compound she had not been able to enter since the burial. It still smelled of him, of the particular cologne he had worn for 20 years, of paper and leather and the faint ghost of cigar smoke from the one cigar he allowed himself on Friday evenings. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before crossing the threshold. She sat at his desk. The surface was exactly as he had left it. A pen beside a notepad. A framed photograph of the 2 of them at Amara's graduation. A small glass paperweight shaped like an oil rig that a client had given him years ago. Adaeze ran her hand across the desk surface slowly, the way you might touch something that had belonged to someone you were not yet ready to stop missing. Then she opened the bottom drawer. It was not the first time she had opened it. She had opened it 2 days after the burial, searching for a particular document. She had found the document. And she had found something else, something she had placed there herself 7 years ago and then, in the way of things placed for safekeeping, almost forgotten about. A small voice recorder. The kind that was common in the early 2000s before phones made them obsolete. A gray plastic device, the size of a soap bar, with a red button on the side and a sliding switch for play and rewind. Adaeze picked it up and held it in her palm. The weight of it was familiar. She had carried it in her bag for a year after the incident, then placed it in the drawer when she decided she would not need it after all. She had been wrong about that. She pressed play. The first sound was static. Then the sound of a room, the ambient noise of a gathering, voices in the background, the clink of glasses. Then two voices, unmistakable and clear, separated from the background by proximity to wherever she had been sitting when the device was recording in her bag. The first voice was Festus. The second was a man named Hargrove. Richard Hargrove. A British oil industry consultant who had come to Port Harcourt 7 years ago with an offer to acquire a controlling stake in Briggs Energy Services. Chitty had refused the offer. What Chitty did not know, what Adaeze had discovered later that same evening at the dinner Hargrove had hosted, was that Festus had been the one who made the introduction. And Festus had been promised a finder's commission, paid privately, outside the knowledge of the company and its founder. The recording was 43 minutes long. On it, Festus and Hargrove discussed the deal in specific detail. The commission amount. The routing of the payment through a third company. The plan to approach Chitty again after softening him with a second meeting that Hargrove described as a social occasion. And, this was the part that had made Adaeze sit very still when she first heard it 7 years ago, the strategy for what to do if Chitty continued to refuse. Festus had said, with the calm of a man discussing weather, that his brother was too emotional about the company. That when the time came, and Festus had said when, not if, the family would be in a position to make decisions that Chitty was too sentimental to make himself. At the time, Adaeze had not fully understood what Festus meant by when the time came. She had assumed he meant if Chitty ever retired. Or if the company faced a serious downturn. She had filed the recording away and told herself it was evidence of greed, not of anything darker, and that she hoped never to need it. Now she understood what Festus had been waiting for. He had been waiting for Chitty to die. Adaeze sat alone in her late husband's study with the recorder in her hand and the rain beginning again outside and the generator humming its faithful note beneath everything, and she felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly. Not anger either. Something harder than both. The particular resolve of a woman who has been underestimated for so long that she has learned to use the blind spot as a door. She placed the recorder carefully in the pocket of her house dress. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not called in 3 years. Barrister Ngozi Okafor answered on the second ring. "Adaeze," she said. "I heard about Chitty. I am so sorry." "Thank you," Adaeze said. "I need your help. I need it quickly and I need it to be very good." A pause. Then Ngozi said, "Tell me everything." Adaeze told her. Not everything, not yet, but enough. When she finished, Ngozi was quiet for a moment. "How long do you have before the board meeting?" "They have not set a date yet. I expect within the month." "That is enough time. But we need to move now. Tomorrow, if possible." "Tomorrow," Adaeze said. "Yes." After the call, she sat for a long time in Chitty's chair. The study settled around her in the dark. The photograph of their two faces at Amara's graduation caught a little light from the window. Adaeze looked at it. Chitty had been laughing in the photograph, his head tilted back, his hand on her shoulder, looking like a man who had everything he needed in one frame. She had taken his name and his company and his children and his 31 years of Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings. She had taken his laughter in a photograph and the smell of his study and the memory of his hand on the small of her back at every gathering where people had whispered that she did not belong. She was going to fight for everything he had built. Not for herself. Not only for herself. For the 31 years of Thursday evenings. For the compound and the generator and the red Port Harcourt earth. For the man who had chosen her when people said she was not enough. She was going to fight because Chitty deserved to have someone fight. And because Festus deserved to finally understand what he had underestimated. Adaeze Briggs had moved through the weeks after Chitty's burial with the precision of a woman who had learned long ago that grief and strategy were not opposites. She grieved in the mornings, in the quiet hour before Mama Benson arrived with breakfast, when the compound was still and the sound of the Niger Delta could be heard faintly beyond the walls, bird call, distant water, the low hum of a city waking. She was strategic in the afternoons, when she sat with Barrister Ngozi Okafor in the small meeting room at the back of the main house, and they worked through the legal architecture of Briggs Energy Services piece by careful piece. The company's structure was, on paper, clean. Chitty had owned 51% of the shares outright. Those shares had passed to his estate upon his death, and the will, drafted carefully, witnessed properly, filed with a firm that Chitty had trusted for 20 years, left everything to Adaeze, with provision made for Obinna and Amara from the personal estate. The company shares were Adaeze's. The law said so clearly. Ngozi confirmed it without hesitation. But the law and what Festus intended to do were two different conversations. He has been speaking to minority shareholders, Ngozi told her one afternoon, spreading documents across the table with the efficient calm of a woman who had spent 25 years in corporate litigation. 3 of them hold a combined 18%. That is not enough to outvote you. But he is not trying to outvote you in the conventional sense. He is trying to create enough instability that the board loses confidence. If the board calls for an emergency governance review and votes to suspend your executive authority pending that review, they can effectively lock you out of company decisions without technically removing you. Adaeze studied the documents. So the board vote is not really about removing me. It is about creating a vacuum. Ngozi nodded. And then filling it with someone more manageable. She paused. Probably himself or a proxy he controls. Adaeze leaned back in her chair. What does he need for that vote to succeed? A majority of the board. 7 members. He needs 4. He currently has 2 he is certain of, your husband's cousin Emeka Briggs, who has always aligned with Festus, and a man named Dixon Obi who joined the board 2 years ago under circumstances worth examining. The other 2 he is working on are independents. A retired engineer named Mr. Amadi, and a woman named Dr. Salome Peppel who joined the board last year. How close is he to securing them? Ngozi's expression shifted slightly. Close enough that we should not wait. What is our position? You have 4 board members who will stand with you. Myself as your legal representative has no board vote, but I will be present. The recording changes things significantly, not because it will determine the board vote directly, but because it changes the conversation around Festus's credibility. If the board understands what he was willing to do 7 years ago, and what he has been planning since the burial, his 2 certain votes may reconsider. And if they do not reconsider? Ngozi looked at her steadily. Then we take it further. But I believe the recording will be enough. I have dealt with men like Festus for 25 years. They rely on the assumption that their targets have nothing. When that assumption is removed, everything else shifts. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he called me his brother's wife. As if that was a category with boundaries. Ngozi picked up her pen. He is about to learn that categories are not walls, she said. They are just words. Outside, the afternoon rain had begun again. Port Harcourt in its wet season was a city of perpetual sound, rain on zinc rooftops, water in the gutters, the deep percussion of drops against the broad-leafed plants in the garden. Adaeze had lived here for 31 years and had never stopped finding it beautiful. There was something about the relentlessness of it. The way the rain kept coming regardless of what was happening in the houses beneath it. She thought of Chitty. She thought of the way he used to sit on the veranda during the rain and say that Port Harcourt was the only city in Nigeria where the weather had character. She thought of his voice saying that. She let herself miss him for exactly 1 minute, which was all she could afford in the afternoons. Then she turned back to the documents. In the evenings, when the legal work was done and Ngozi had gone home and Mama Benson had laid dinner on the table in the kitchen because neither of them could bear to eat in the formal dining room anymore, Adaeze sat with the voice recorder. She had listened to the full 43 minutes 4 times now. She knew it the way you came to know something that had been waiting for you, not just its content but its texture, its silences, the particular quality of Festus's voice when he believed no one important was listening. The most important section was between the 21st and 28th minute. She had noted the counter numbers on the side of the device. In those 7 minutes, Festus said 3 things that the recording made permanent. First, that he had been approached by Hargrove before Hargrove approached Chitty, and that the introduction had been arranged privately without informing the company. Second, that he had received a payment from Hargrove's firm, he named the amount, which was substantial, routed through a logistics company in Warri that Adaeze had never heard of before. Third, and this was the part that had changed the temperature of the room when Ngozi first heard it, that when the time came, the family would make sure that woman does not walk away with everything Chitty built. That woman. Ngozi had been very still when that phrase came through the small speaker. Then she had looked at Adaeze and said quietly, "He has been planning this since before Chitty died." Adaeze had nodded once. "Yes," she had said. "I know." What she did not say was what she had felt in the moment she realized it, not fury, which was what most people would have expected, but something colder and cleaner. Relief. The relief of a woman who had suspected the worst for years and could now finally stop wondering. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Adaeze had known it would be a Thursday. Everything in her life seemed to happen on Thursdays. She had buried Chitty on a Thursday. She had married him on a Thursday. She had signed the first lease for the company's original office on a Thursday, her hand on the pen, Chitty watching with that particular expression he had when something real was beginning. Thursdays, she had decided, were not bad days. They were just the days on which her life insisted on moving. The meeting was called for 10 in the morning at the company's head office in Romuald, the same building Chitty had moved into when the company outgrew its first address, a 5-story structure with the company name in raised brass letters above the entrance and a lobby that smelled of air conditioning and the particular ambition of a business that had decided to stay. Adaeze had been in this building hundreds of times. She had attended client meetings here, signed contracts, hosted visiting partners from Abuja and Lagos and once from Aberdeen. She knew every floor. She knew which elevator was slow, which bathroom on the 3rd floor had the window that overlooked the creek, which conference room had a faulty overhead light that maintenance had never quite fixed. She arrived at 9:30. 30 minutes early. She had dressed with the care of someone who understood that appearance in a room of doubt was its own kind of testimony. A deep burgundy lace blouse. A black wrapper with a fine gold border. Her hair wrapped neatly with a piece of the same burgundy fabric. Gold earrings, small, not loud. The kind that said, "I belong in every room I have ever entered." Mama Benson had watched her dress that morning from the doorway. "You look like Oga's wife," Mama Benson had said softly. Adaeze had turned to look at her. "I am more than that today," she had replied. Mama Benson had nodded once. "I know," she had said. "That is what I meant." Ngozi arrived 2 minutes after Adaeze. She carried a leather document bag and wore a dark green suit with the collar pressed so sharply it looked like a decision. She shook Adaeze's hand at the entrance and said nothing beyond a quiet nod that meant, "I am ready." "Are you?" Adaeze's nod back said, "Yes." They went upstairs together. The boardroom was on the 4th floor. It was a long room with a mahogany table that seated 14 and windows that looked out over the city toward the distant gray-green shimmer of the river. There were already people inside when Adaeze entered, the company secretary, 2 board members who had arrived early, and a young woman from the legal team arranging water glasses along the table with the focused attention of someone who had been told the meeting was important without being told why. Adaeze took her seat at the head of the table. For a moment, no one in the room said anything. The 2 board members who had arrived early, both part of her block of 4, looked at her and then at each other. One of them was a man named Chief Festus, an old associate of Chitty's from the early years who had been on the board for 16 years and carried himself with the compressed dignity of someone who had seen the company born and had no intention of watching it be stolen. The other was a woman named Mrs. Ekine, the company's longest-serving finance director, now in her late 60s, whose understanding of Briggs Energy's financial architecture was so complete that Adaeze sometimes thought the company existed partly inside her memory. "You are early," Mrs. Ekine said quietly. "So are you," Adaeze replied. Both women recognized the compliment. The others arrived in groups. The two independent directors, Mr. Amadi and Dr. Pepple, came together, which Adaeze noted. They sat in the middle of the table, the position of people who had not yet decided which side of a room they belonged on. Dixon Obi arrived next, a man in his 40s with the careful grooming of someone who believed presentation created authority. He sat on Festus's side of the table without hesitation. Adaeze Briggs, Chitty's cousin and Festus's reliable ally, arrived shortly after and took the seat beside Obi. They did not greet Adaeze directly. She noted that too. Festus arrived at 10:15. His lawyer came with him, not the young man from the compound visit but a senior partner from a Port Harcourt firm, older, heavier, carrying his briefcase with the authority of a man who billed by the hour and intended to earn every naira. Festus entered the boardroom and looked at Adaeze sitting at the head of the table, and something passed across his face, surprise, quickly managed, quickly covered with the broad social ease he deployed like a tool. "Ada," he said, as if this were a family gathering. He sat down. His lawyer sat beside him. The room was full now. The company secretary opened the meeting. He ran through the formalities, the quorum confirmation, the agenda items, the reading of the notice. His voice was neutral, carefully so, the voice of a man who had been in this building long enough to understand that his job required him to have no opinion about anything that mattered. Festus's lawyer, whose name was Barrister Clement Osuji, spoke first on behalf of his client. His presentation was polished and not entirely dishonest, that was what made it dangerous. He spoke of the company's vulnerability in the period following its founder's death. He spoke of investor confidence, of client relationships that required relationship management, of the complexity of running a company in the Niger Delta without the particular kind of social capital that Chitty Briggs had spent decades accumulating. He did not say directly that Adaeze was incapable. He arranged facts around her in a pattern that invited the room to reach that conclusion without being pushed. He proposed a governance restructuring. An interim management committee to oversee company operations pending a strategic review. The committee, by his proposal, would be chaired by Chief Festus Briggs. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Adaeze looked at the table. Then she looked at Mr. Amadi and Dr. Pepple, the two independents, and saw on their faces the particular expression of people who had been given a story and were still deciding if they believed it. She had expected that. She had prepared for it. Ngozi rose. She spoke for 12 minutes. Adaeze had heard the argument rehearsed twice, but even knowing what was coming, she found herself moved by the architecture of it, the way Ngozi built her case, the way the best builders built houses, starting with the foundation and moving up without a wasted element. She established Adaeze's legal standing with the clarity of someone who expected to be challenged on every point. She cited the will, the shareholding structure, the company's articles of association. She presented a brief history of Adaeze's documented involvement in the company over 3 decades, correspondence, signed documents, meeting minutes, a client letter from 12 years ago in which a major partner had specifically thanked both Mr. and Mrs. Briggs for their hospitality and guidance. She was methodical. She was thorough. And when she sat down, the room's balance had shifted enough that Festus's lawyer leaned toward him and said something low and quick. Then Festus himself spoke. He did not use his lawyer this time. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and spoke with the particular warmth of a man who had decided to be reasonable. He said he had no desire to diminish Adaeze. He said he respected her deeply as his late brother's wife. He said this was not personal, this was business, and business required clarity. He said Chitty himself, in a private conversation, had expressed concern about who would carry the company forward. He said this with the confidence of someone invoking the dead because the dead cannot contradict. Adaeze listened to this with her hands still on the table. She waited until Festus finished. Then she looked at Ngozi. Ngozi reached into the document bag and placed the voice recorder on the table. The room's attention moved to it immediately. Such a small thing, gray, old, slightly scuffed at one corner. It looked out of place among the water glasses and legal folders. It looked exactly like what it was, something ordinary that had outlasted the assumptions of extraordinary people. Adaeze spoke for the first time since the meeting began. She had been quiet for an hour and 15 minutes. The room felt the weight of that silence breaking. "My husband built this company from nothing," she said. Her voice was even. Not loud. The kind of voice that made people lean forward. "He built it in this city, in this industry, with the particular difficulty of being an indigenous operator in a field that did not always welcome him. I stood beside him for every year of that. I know this company the way I know my own children, not because it is written anywhere but because I was there when it was growing." She paused. "Chief Festus has suggested that my husband expressed concerns about succession. I have known my husband for 31 years. I know the difference between a man expressing concern and a man making a decision. Chidi made his decision in his will. What is being proposed today is not a governance matter. It is an attempt to set aside that decision." She reached forward and pressed the play button on the recorder. The quality was imperfect, as all old recordings were, but the voices were clear. The ambient room noise gave it the character of something real, something captured without staging. The boardroom went completely silent. Festus's voice came first. It filled the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed no one was recording him. "The commission routing is clean. Worry account. Nothing traces back." Then Hargrove's voice, British and clipped, "And if Chidi continues to hold out on the acquisition? Festus, he will not hold out indefinitely. The man is emotional about the company. It is a weakness. When the time comes, and it will come, the family will be in a position to make the right decisions. The decisions Chidi is too sentimental to make himself." Hargrove, and the wife? Festus, she is not a factor. She has no standing in the company structurally. When the time comes, that woman does not walk away with everything Chidi built. Ngozi reached over and stopped the recording. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence before. It was the silence of a room whose air had changed. Adaeze looked at Festus. He had gone still in the way of a man whose performance has been interrupted by something he cannot manage with performance. His lawyer had a pen in his hand that he was not using. Dixon Obi was looking at the table. Even Adaeze Briggs, who had arrived in the room as Festus's most reliable ally, had the expression of someone reassessing the geography of the situation. Mr. Amadi, one of the independent directors, cleared his throat. He was a man of perhaps 70, a retired petroleum engineer with close-cropped white hair and the careful speech of someone who had spent a career measuring words against outcomes. "Chief Festus," he said quietly, "is that your voice on that recording?" Festus looked at his lawyer. His lawyer touched his arm. Festus looked back at Mr. Amadi. He said nothing. That was enough. Dr. Pepple, the other independent director, spoke next. She was younger than the others, perhaps 50, with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead and the direct manner of an academic who had not spent enough time in rooms like this to have learned their particular evasions. "What was the amount of the commission?" she asked. "Not of Festus. Of Ngozi, who had the documents." Ngozi placed a sheet on the table. The amount circulated. Someone inhaled audibly. Chief Damanabo, who had sat in silence through the entire proceeding, now spoke. His voice was low and carried the authority of a man who had been in this boardroom since the table was new. He looked at Festus directly. "You came here today," he said, to remove this woman from the company her husband built while you were accepting payments from a foreign firm trying to acquire that company without the founder's knowledge. He let the sentence sit. Is that a correct summary? Festus's lawyer began to speak. Chief Damanabo raised one hand. I did not ask you. He was still looking at Festus. The room waited. Festus's composure had not entirely deserted him, he was too experienced a man for that, but something behind it had. The particular certainty that had carried him into the room, the absolute conviction that he had calculated correctly and that Adaeze had nothing, had gone. Its absence changed the shape of his face. This recording, Festus said at last, his voice measured, was obtained without consent. It has no legal weight. Ngozi answered before he finished the sentence. In a civil proceeding examining the conduct of a company director, it has considerable weight as documentary evidence of intent and prior conduct. She looked at him without heat. And the question before this board is not a legal one. It is a question of character. The room was very quiet again. Adaeze looked at the two independent directors. Mr. Amadi had his hands flat on the table, looking at the recorder. Dar. Pepple had her glasses down from her forehead now and was looking at Adaeze with an expression Adaeze recognized, the expression of someone who had come into a room with one understanding of the story and was leaving it with another. I would like to call a vote, Adaeze said. Ngozi seconded. The company secretary confirmed the motion. The vote was taken. Adaeze 4 held firm, Chief Damanabo, Mrs. Ikine, and two others who had known Chidi long enough to know the difference between the company he built and the company Festus imagined he deserved. Mr. Amadi voted with Adaeze after a pause that lasted perhaps 5 seconds but felt longer. Dr. Pepple voted with Adaeze without the pause. Dixon Obi voted for Festus's motion. Adaeze Briggs voted for Festus's motion. Festus himself, as a non-board observer, had no vote, which Adaeze knew he had not planned for when he originally designed his approach. The motion to restructure governance and install an interim management committee was defeated. 6 votes to 2. The meeting was adjourned by the company secretary in a voice that was still carefully neutral but carried beneath it the faintest relief of a man who had served the company faithfully and was glad it was still the company he recognized. Festus stood slowly. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. His lawyer was already gathering documents. Adaeze Briggs would not look at Adaeze. Dixon Obi studied the water glass in front of him with unnecessary focus. The independents remained seated, exchanging a few quiet words with Ngozi. Festus looked at Adaeze across the length of the mahogany table. She looked back at him. She did not feel triumph. Not exactly. What she felt was the particular settling of a weight that had been carried too long, the weight of being seen as insufficient, as peripheral, as the woman beside the man rather than the person in the room. That weight had been put down somewhere between the 21st and 28th minute of a 43-year-old recording, and it was not going back on. You should have accepted her, Chief Damanabo said to Festus quietly as he passed. Chidi knew what he had. Festus did not respond. He walked out. The door closed behind him. The boardroom was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Ikine, the finance director, who had said almost nothing during the entire proceeding, looked at Adaeze and said, "What would you like to do first?" It was the question of someone who recognized authority and was ready to work under it. Adaeze felt something in her chest that was close to tears and chose not to be it. Not here. Not yet. She looked at the window. Outside, Port Harcourt spread in every direction under a sky that had been threatening rain all morning and had not yet decided. The river glittered at the edge of the horizon. The city moved and breathed and continued. She thought of Chidi. She thought of the way he had looked at her on the day they signed the first office lease, the way he had held the pen toward her and said, "Sign it with me." As if the thing they were starting belonged to both of them from the beginning. It had. It always had. "I would like to begin with the quarterly client review," Adaeze said. Her voice was steady. "The reports should have gone out last week. Let us find out where we are." Mrs. Ekine nodded and began to gather her files. Chief Damanabo leaned back with the satisfied exhale of a man who had wagered on the right outcome. The company secretary was already at his laptop. Ngozi came to stand beside Adaeze as the room began to reorganize itself around the ordinary business of a company continuing. She placed one hand briefly on Adaeze's arm and said nothing. Adaeze covered that hand with her own for a moment. Then they both turned back to the table. In the weeks that followed, the legal processes moved with the deliberate pace of official things. Festus's lawyers sent letters. Ngozi's office responded to every one. An investigation into the commission payment was initiated by the company's compliance team, with Ngozi's documentation as the foundation. Dixon Obi quietly resigned from the board before the investigation concluded, citing personal commitments. Adaeze Briggs sent Adaeze a message through a mutual cousin, not an apology exactly, but a withdrawal, a stepping back from the position he had arrived in the boardroom to defend. Adaeze read the message and chose not to respond. Some things did not require a response. They required only acknowledgement. Obinna came home from London 3 weeks after the board meeting. He spent 2 weeks in Port Harcourt, sitting in his father's office, learning the company from the inside. He was not yet ready to take a leadership role, he said so honestly, which Adaeze appreciated more than she could say, but he wanted to understand what he would one day inherit. She took him through every floor of the building. She introduced him to every senior staff member by name. She showed him the original lease document from the first office in Romuald, preserved in a folder in the company archives. Obinna held it and was quiet for a long time. Amara came too, for a long weekend, and sat at the kitchen table with Adaeze and Mama Benson and ate egusi soup and said very little except that she was proud and that she missed her father and that she was glad the company was safe. 3 things. All true. All enough. One evening, about 6 weeks after the board meeting, Adaeze sat alone in Chitty's study again. The room still smelled of him, though faintly now. The cologne was beginning to lose its hold on the air, the way grief itself began to thin with time without ever fully clearing. She sat in his chair with her hands in her lap and the voice recorder on the desk in front of her. She had given a copy of the recording to Ngozi for the legal file. The original she had kept. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. Gray plastic, slightly scuffed, a red button on the side. She had carried it in her bag for a year without knowing it would matter. She had placed it in a drawer and lived her life for 7 years without knowing when it would be needed. It had waited with the patience of something that understood it was not the point, only the instrument. The point was the 31 years. The point was the Thursday mornings and the rainy evenings and the client dinners and the document signings and the way Chitty had always turned toward her when he needed to think out loud and the way she had always been there to think alongside him. The point was that you could love a person and a life so completely that the record of it accumulated without your noticing, in drawers, in archives, in the memory of housekeepers and colleagues and a mahogany boardroom table that had witnessed the moment everything was finally confirmed. Mama Benson appeared in the doorway. She looked at the recorder in Adaeze's hand and said nothing for a moment. "You should rest," she said at last. Adaeze nodded. She placed the recorder back in the drawer. She closed it. She would not need to open it again. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the compound was quiet. The night air carried the distant sound of the city and the closer sound of crickets and the familiar hum of the generator keeping the lights on. The same lights that had been on when Chitty was here. The same gate. The same red earth. The same Port Harcourt sky above all of it, wide and indifferent and beautiful. Mama Benson had gone to the kitchen. From somewhere below, Adaeze could smell onions and the first warmth of soup beginning. She stood at the window a moment longer. Then she turned and walked downstairs toward the light. Some people spend their whole lives preparing to be dismissed. They learn early that the world has decided what they are worth, and they spend decades carrying that decision like luggage they were never asked to pack. Adaeze Briggs carried it too. But she also carried something else, the quiet knowledge of a woman who had built a life alongside a man, brick by brick, year by year, without her name ever appearing on the wall. When the moment came to prove that she had always been there, she did not need a battle cry or a performance. She needed only the truth. And the truth, it turned out, had been waiting in a drawer the whole time. This is for every woman who was told she brought nothing to the table. You were the table. Thank you for watching this story on Zara Tales. If it moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. The days between that phone call and the first meeting with Ngozi were the loneliest Adaeze had known since the burial itself. Not because people were absent, the compound was rarely empty in those weeks. Relatives came and went. Church women arrived in groups with food containers and sympathetic expressions. Old friends of Chitty stopped by to pay their respects, men in their 60s and 70s who sat in the parlor and told stories about her husband that she had sometimes heard before and sometimes had not. The compound had the particular crowded quality of a house in mourning, full of presents and yet fundamentally alone, because the one presence that mattered was gone. But the loneliness Adaeze carried in those days was not about the house. It was about the knowledge. She had heard the recording. She knew what Festus was planning. And she could not yet tell anyone in that crowd of mourners and well-wishers what she knew, because every conversation in a house of grief moved through the same channels, and she could not afford for her intentions to reach Festus before she was ready. So she sat with it. She received condolences with grace. She thanked people for the food. She listened to the stories about Chitty and kept her face composed and her eyes clear. And beneath all of it, in the quiet place below the performance of grief, she planned. Mama Benson watched her. That was the thing about Mama Benson, she watched without intruding, which was a skill rarer than it appeared. On the fourth day after Festus's visit, when the house had cleared of the last afternoon visitors and Adaeze sat alone in the sitting room with a cup of tea she was not drinking, Mama Benson came in and sat down across from her. "You are thinking about the company," Mama Benson said. Adaeze looked at her. "How did you know?" "Because when you think about Olga, your face goes soft. When you think about the company, your face goes still." She paused. "It has been still for 4 days." Adaeze set down the tea. "I cannot talk about it yet. I am not asking you to." Mama Benson folded her hands in her lap. "I just want you to know I see it." Adaeze looked at the older woman, her gray temples, her steady hands, the expression on her face that was not pity and not false comfort but something more enduring than either. She thought of how many mornings Mama Benson had been the first person she heard in the compound. How many times the sound of her in the kitchen had been the signal that the day was beginning and that it was safe to begin with it. "He trusted you very much," Adaeze said. Mama Benson nodded once. "And I trusted him." She met Adaeze's eyes. "I trust you the same." It was not a declaration. It was a fact. Adaeze received it as one. They did not speak for a few minutes after that. The generator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the road. Eventually Mama Benson rose and went back to the kitchen, and Adaeze sat with something that was not quite peace but was close enough to rest on. On the 6th day after Festus's visit, 2 things happened. The first was a phone call from Obinna in London. He had been contacted, he said carefully, by a lawyer he did not know. The lawyer had introduced himself as representing family interests and had asked Obinna several questions about the company structure and about whether Obinna felt he had adequate legal representation as a beneficiary of the estate. Obinna had been polite and said nothing committal, but his voice on the phone carried the controlled alarm of a man who understood that something was being tested. "Who sent him?" Obinna asked. "I have a reasonable suspicion," Adaeze said. "Did he give you a name for the firm?" Obinna gave her the name. She wrote it down. When she shared it later with Ngozi, Ngozi looked at the paper and said, that firm does most of Festus Briggs's corporate work. She said it without surprise, the way experienced lawyers said things that confirmed what they already knew. The second thing that happened on the sixth day was simpler and in some ways more unsettling. One of Chitty's junior business associates, a man named Ekpo, who had built a decent supply chain company on the back of contracts that flowed through Briggs Energy, came to pay his respects. He was polite, appropriately solemn, sat for the right amount of time. But as he was leaving, he said to Adaeze with the careful casualness of someone who had rehearsed nonchalance, "You know, if there is ever anything I can do to support during the transition, I have connections with some of the major clients. Informal ones. I could help manage relationships." Manage relationships, Adaeze had repeated, her voice unchanged. "Just to ensure continuity," Ekpo said. He smiled. "These things need steady hands." After he left, Mama Benson, who had been standing near the doorway during the conversation, looked at Adaeze. "He has already spoken to Festus," Adaeze said. Mama Benson did not dispute it. She said, "That one was always waiting to see which way the wind blew." Adaeze filed Ekpo away in the part of her mind she reserved for people who had answered the question of character before being asked. Then she turned to the more pressing work. Her first meeting with Ngozi happened the following week, in the small meeting room at the back of the main house. Ngozi arrived carrying a laptop and 2 folders and the focused attention of someone who had been thinking about the situation since the phone call. She was a woman of perhaps 58, Adaeze's contemporary, with short natural hair and the precise speech of someone who had spent decades in rooms where imprecision cost clients money. She had been one of Chitty's earliest business advisors and had transitioned over the years into a trusted personal counsel. She had not been hired to handle the estate, Chitty had another firm for that, but Adaeze trusted her in a way that went beyond the formal structure of the attorney-client relationship. She trusted her the way you trusted someone who had been honest with you when it was inconvenient. Ngozi spread the company documents on the table and spent 40 minutes asking questions Adaeze had not been asked before, not about grief or health or how she was managing, but about shareholding structures, board composition, company bylaws, and the specific language of Chitty's will regarding the transfer of shares. Adaeze answered every question without hesitation. 31 years of standing beside the company had given her a knowledge of its architecture that she had never been asked to demonstrate formally. Now she demonstrated it. Ngozi listened and wrote. When they finished the first session, Ngozi sat back and looked at Adaeze with an expression that was close to satisfaction. "You know this company better than most people sitting on its board," she said. Adaeze did not find this remarkable. She had simply been paying attention for 3 decades. But she understood what Ngozi meant. The assumption, Festus's assumption, the assumption of every person who had watched her stand beside Chitty and concluded she was ornamental, was that proximity was not the same as understanding. Ngozi was confirming what Adaeze already knew, the assumption was wrong. They met 3 more times before the board meeting. Each session built on the last. Ngozi mapped the board with the precision of a strategist identifying terrain, who was loyal, who was wavering, who had been cultivated by Festus and through what means. The picture that emerged was not surprising but it was clarifying. Festus had been working the board for longer than Adaeze had realized. Not since Chitty's death but before it, slowly, patiently, in the way that men who anticipated outcomes began positioning themselves before the outcome arrived. He spoke to Amadi at a conference in Abuja 8 months ago, Ngozi told her in their 3rd session. A petroleum industry gathering. They had dinner. Nothing on paper. But a colleague of mine attended the same event and noticed them. 8 months ago, Adaeze said. Chitty was still alive. Yes. Neither woman said the obvious thing. They both understood it. He also made a donation to a foundation linked to Dr. Pepple's research institution, Ngozi continued. 2 months ago. She may not even know the source, these things are often routed. But it creates a relationship, however unconscious. Can we counter it? Not directly. We cannot undo a donation. But we can make sure Dr. Pepple understands the full picture before she votes. How? By ensuring she hears the recording, Ngozi said, before the board meeting. Not in the meeting. Before it. Adaeze considered this. You want to speak to her privately. I want you to speak to her privately. Not to persuade. Not to pressure. Just to ensure she is deciding with full information. Adaeze thought of Dr. Pepple. She had met her once, at a company function the previous year. A compact woman with the direct manner of someone who had built a career on evidence. A woman who would not respond well to being lobbied. But who might respond to being respected. Arrange it, Adaeze said. Ngozi nodded and made a note. Then she said, there is something else I need to tell you. And I want you to hear it without reacting until I have finished. Adaeze straightened slightly. Go ahead. Dixon Obi, Ngozi said, did not come to the board through a normal nomination process. He was proposed by a third party 2 years ago and approved in a board session where 2 of your loyal members were absent for a site visit. The proposing party was a holding company. I spent 3 days tracing the holding company. She placed a document on the table. It connects, through 2 intermediary entities, to a logistics firm in Warri. Adaeze was still. The same logistics firm. The same name that appears in the recording, Ngozi confirmed. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon rain had begun again. Port Harcourt and its relentless wet season. Adaeze looked at the document and then out the window and then back at Ngozi. He placed his own person on the board 2 years ago, she said. Before Chitty died. Yes. Adaeze felt the cold clarity again. The same feeling she had felt in the study with the recorder in her hand. Not fury. Just the removal of uncertainty. The picture was now complete. How long, she asked quietly, do you think he has been planning this? Ngozi's voice was careful. Since before the Hargrove approach. The recording you have is from 7 years ago. But the Warri company was incorporated 9 years ago. She paused. Festus has been building toward this for a long time. Adaeze nodded slowly. Then she said something she had not said to anyone since the burial. She said, Chitty knew his brother was not trustworthy. He told me once, years ago. He said, Festus loves me in the way that some people love things they did not get. Not love exactly. Hunger. Ngozi did not speak. I told him he was being uncharitable, Adaeze said. She looked at the table. I was wrong. The meeting with Dr. Pepple happened 4 days before the board vote. Adaeze had asked Ngozi to make the approach, not as a legal summons, not as a formal request, but as one woman asking another if they might speak privately before an important decision. Dr. Pepple had agreed, which Adaeze took as a sign of intellectual honesty. A woman in Festus's pocket would have declined. They met at a hotel in Gra, neutral ground, which Adaeze had chosen deliberately. Dr. Pepple arrived exactly on time in a dark dress with a briefcase and the expression of someone who had prepared herself for an uncomfortable conversation and was determined to be professional regardless. Adaeze liked her immediately. Not warmly, there was not yet room for warmth, but with the particular respect one gave to someone whose instincts were clearly sound even in a compromised situation. They ordered tea. They spoke for a few minutes about the company. Technical questions on Dr. Pepple's part, answered directly by Adaeze. Dr. Pepple was testing something. Adaeze let herself be tested. Then Dr. Pepple said, I want to be transparent with you, Mrs. Briggs. Someone on the board reached out to me before this meeting. They suggested that your interest in speaking with me might be an attempt to influence my vote. Adaeze set down her cup. What was your response? Dr. Pepple's mouth curved slightly. I said that if Mrs. Briggs wishes to speak with me, I would like to hear what she has to say and form my own judgment. She paused. I did not tell them I had already agreed to meet you. Adaeze studied her face. What would help you form that judgment? She asked. Information, Dr. Pepple said simply. Accurate information. I joined this board because the company has a serious record of contribution to the regional economy. I have no interest in being used by anyone. Adaeze reached into her bag and placed the recorder on the table between them. Then she pressed play. She watched Dr. Pepple's face as the 43 minutes unfolded. The woman was practiced at stillness. She had the controlled expression of an academic accustomed to receiving difficult data without telegraphing her reaction. But at the 23rd minute, when Festus's voice said that woman does not walk away with everything Chitty built, something moved briefly across Dr. Pepple's face. Not outrage. Something quieter. The particular expression of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed and is mourning being right. When the recording ended, Dr. Pepple was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long have you had this?" 7 years, Adaeze said. I did not know I would need it. Dr. Pepple looked at the recorder. Then at Adaeze. Then she picked up her teacup and drank from it slowly, as if organizing her thoughts around the warmth of it. I have 4 questions, she said. Ask them, Adaeze said. Dr. Pepple asked them. They were precise, technical, and fair. Adaeze answered every one without hesitation. By the end, Dr. Pepple had set down her cup and was sitting with her hands folded in a particular way that Adaeze recognized as the posture of someone who had made a decision. Thank you for this meeting, Dr. Pepple said. I will see you on Thursday. Adaeze nodded. Thank you for coming. As she walked to her car afterward, Adaeze allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite relief and not quite confidence but occupied the same neighborhood as both. Then she got in the car and went home to prepare for Thursday. The evening before the board meeting, Adaeze sat in the kitchen with Mama Benson long after dinner was finished. The plates had been cleared. The kitchen smelled of pepper soup and the particular cleanliness of a room that had been used well and put back in order. Mama Benson sat across the table with a cup of tea. Adaeze had water. They had been sitting in comfortable silence for perhaps 20 minutes when Mama Benson said, "Do you remember when you first came to this house?" Adaeze looked at her. "Of course. You were very nervous," Mama Benson said. "Not on the outside. But I could tell. Was I that obvious?" "Only to me." Mama Benson smiled faintly. "Olga brought you home for a Sunday lunch. His mother was still alive then. His family came. Festus came with his wife." Adaeze nodded. She remembered. She remembered Festus's wife looking at her dress in the way some women looked at things they were deciding whether to approve of. She remembered the particular silence when she walked into the sitting room, the way conversation paused just a beat too long before resuming. "What did you think of me?" Adaeze asked. Mama Benson considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I thought, this woman knows she is not welcome. And she is staying anyway." She looked at Adaeze. "That told me everything I needed to know." Adaeze felt something move in her throat. She swallowed it. "I almost left," she admitted. "The first time I came here. When his mother barely looked at me. I almost went home and told Chitty I had changed my mind." Mama Benson nodded as if she had suspected this. "What made you stay?" Adaeze thought about it. She thought about Chitty's hand finding hers under the table at that Sunday lunch. The way he had pressed it once, briefly, without looking at her, just the pressure of his fingers saying, "I see this. I am here. I am not going anywhere." "He held my hand," she said simply. Mama Benson smiled. "Yes," she said. That was the kind of man he was. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, Port Harcourt moved through its evening, generators humming across the neighborhood, the distant call of a hawker, the sound of the gate being checked by the night security man. Tomorrow will be hard, Mama Benson said at last. Adaeze looked at the table. Yes. But you are ready. Adaeze thought of the recorder in her bag, already packed for the morning. She thought of Ngozi's 12-minute argument, rehearsed until it was as smooth as water. She thought of Dr. Pepple's folded hands and the expression that meant a decision had been made. She thought of Chief Damanabo, who had known Chitty since before the first office, who had sat at that mahogany table through every stage of the company's life and was not going to watch it be taken. She thought of Chitty holding her hand under the table 30 years ago in a room full of people who had already decided she was not enough. Yes, she said. I am ready. Mama Benson stood and collected the cups. She paused by the door on her way out. I will make pap in the morning, she said. You need something warm before you go. Adaeze almost laughed, the particular, helpless, grateful almost laugh of someone who understood that some people showed love in the most specific and irreplaceable ways. Thank you, she said. Mama Benson went to bed. Adaeze sat alone in the kitchen for a while longer. She did not think about the meeting. She had done all her thinking. She only sat and listened to the compound around her, the generator, the night, the particular silence of a house that was still learning how to be itself without the person who had anchored it. Tomorrow it would begin. And she would be there to meet it the same way she had met every difficult thing in 31 years of a life that had asked more of her than it showed. Quietly. Completely. Without looking away. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the particular stillness that Port Harcourt sometimes produced between its rains, a held-breath quality to the air, the sky pale and undecided, the city moving beneath it with the ordinary business of itself. Adaeze was awake before 5. She did not try to sleep after 4:30, which was when she had accepted that sleep was finished for the night. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the compound, and then she rose and washed and dressed slowly, with the care she had promised herself the night before. The burgundy lace. The black wrapper with the gold border. The small earrings. She stood before the mirror and looked at herself for a long moment, not with vanity, not with doubt, but with the particular attention of a woman taking inventory before a journey. She saw what was there. 63 years. Gray at her temples that she had stopped covering 5 years ago because Chitty had said he loved it. The lines around her eyes that were not softened by good light but were her own. A face that had learned to hold things without showing them, which was a skill she had not chosen but had needed. She looked, she thought, like someone who had earned the right to walk into a room. Mama Benson had the pap ready at 6, warm, smooth, with a thin layer of sugar on top the way Adaeze had always taken it since childhood. There was also bread, fried eggs, a half orange. Adaeze ate everything. Not because she was hungry but because Mama Benson had made it and because she had been right the evening before. You did not go into a battle on an empty foundation. Ngozi arrived at 8:30 in a dark green suit pressed sharp enough to make a statement. They reviewed the plan once more in the sitting room, speaking quietly and quickly, the way people who have prepared thoroughly speak when the preparation is done and only the doing remains. Ngozi confirmed that the documentation was in order, that the company secretary had been properly notified, that the quorum would be present. Adaeze confirmed that the recorder was in her bag. They looked at each other. There was nothing left to say that had not been said. They left the compound at 9. In the car, Adaeze watched Port Harcourt pass outside the window. The GRA roads were quiet this early, the big compounds behind their walls showing only their gates and trees. Then the road widened and the city opened up, traffic beginning to build, roadside stalls coming alive, a bus discharging passengers near a junction, a woman balancing a tray on her head moving through it all with the particular grace of long practice. Ordinary life, going on. Adaeze found this steadying. Whatever happened in the next few hours, the city would continue. The rain would come or it would not come. The generator would hum that evening regardless. She thought of Chitty. Not of his death but of his life, of the particular energy he had brought into every room he entered, the way he could make a business meeting feel like a gathering of people who were glad to be there. She had spent 31 years watching the quality of his work and had sometimes wondered if she possessed anything comparable. She had decided long ago that she did not. Chitty's warmth was specific to him. What she possessed was different, a quality she had never named but which had carried her through every difficult room of her adult life. A stillness that did not waver. An attention that did not miss. A patience that had outlasted every assumption people had made about her limitations. Today she would find out how far that quality could carry her. They arrived at the building in Romuald at 9:30. The brass letters above the entrance caught the morning light. 2 security men at the lobby entrance greeted Adaeze with the careful respect of people who understood that something significant was happening today without knowing exactly what. She greeted them by name, Emmanuel, the older one, who had been at his post since the company moved to the building, and a younger man named Friday who had started the previous year. Chitty had always known the names of the people who opened his doors. Adaeze had learned from him that this was not merely politeness. It was how you built a place where people wanted to come to work. In the lift, Ngozi checked her phone once and put it away. 4th floor, the doors opened, and they stepped into the corridor that led to the boardroom. Through the glass panels along the wall, Adaeze could see the city spread out in every direction, the rooftops and the trees and the gray-green shimmer of the water at the edges of the horizon. She had looked at this view many times. Today it felt like something she was choosing to keep. Chief Damanabo was already inside when they entered. He rose when he saw Adaeze and crossed the room to take her hand in both of his, a gesture she recognized as his particular form of solidarity, warm and brief and unembellished. He said nothing, which was the right thing. Mrs. Ekine arrived moments later and sat beside Adaeze without ceremony, opening her files with the focus of a woman who had decided this meeting was a financial matter and intended to treat it as one. The room filled slowly. Adaeze watched each person enter. She tracked posture, expression, eye contact. Dixon Obi came in looking at his phone, which meant he was avoiding looking at her. Adaeze Briggs came in looking at the window, which meant the same thing by different means. Mr. Amadi arrived with a cup of tea from somewhere in the building and sat in the center of the table with the expression of a man who had not yet made a decision and was still comfortable saying so. Dar. Pepple arrived last among the board members, 2 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, exactly on time, not a second early, which told Adaeze that the woman had thought carefully about what her timing communicated. She sat in the center of the table, 1 seat from Mr. Amadi, and opened a notebook. She did not look at Adaeze directly. She did not look away from her either. She simply began reading a document she had brought. Adaeze understood this as the behavior of someone who had made a decision and was not going to telegraph it before the moment required it. Then Festus arrived. He came through the door with his lawyer and with the specific energy of a man who had done his accounting and believed the numbers were in his favor. He was dressed well, a dark agbada over a crisp white kaftan, the quiet display of a man who understood that cloth communicated authority in this part of the world. He greeted the room with the broad social ease that had always been his most effective tool. He shook hands with Emeka. He nodded to Dixon Obi. He looked at Adaeze last, and looked at her the way he always had, not with dislike, which would have required acknowledging her as a worthy adversary, but with the particular benign dismissal of someone who had already filed you under resolved. Ada, he said. Festus, she said. He sat down. His lawyer arranged papers beside him. The company secretary called the meeting to order. What happened in the next 90 minutes was the most important sequence of Adaeze's life, and she experienced it with the strange doubled awareness of someone who is both fully present and simultaneously watching themselves be present. She heard Barrister Osuji's polished presentation, the words about governance and continuity and client relationships arranged to imply her insufficiency without naming it. She felt the room absorbing the argument, the subtle shift in the body language of the wavering members as the presentation built its case. She watched Festus's face across the table, composed and confident, the face of a man who had planned for every contingency except the one sitting in Adaeze's bag. When Ngozi rose, Adaeze watched the room respond to her differently than it had responded to Osuji. Osuji had spoken the language of corporate concern. Ngozi spoke the language of fact, and fact had a different texture. The shareholding documentation, the will, the 3 decades of signed correspondence, each element landed and settled rather than sliding past. Adaeze saw Mr. Amadi straighten slightly during the client letter. She saw Dr. Pepple make a note. She saw Chief Damanabo sit back with the expression of someone hearing confirmation of what they already believed. Then Festus spoke. And this was the hardest part, not because his argument was strong, but because it was familiar. She had heard versions of it for 31 years. The warmth deployed as authority. The invocation of Chitty's name as if he spoke on Festus's behalf. The smooth reasonableness of a man who had spent decades being charming enough that people mistook charm for trustworthiness. She had spent 31 years watching people give Festus the benefit of doubt he had not earned. She had watched Chitty give it to him most of all. Chitty, who believed in the fundamental decency of family until the recording in the bottom drawer had suggested otherwise, and even then had chosen to believe the recorder more than his own brother. When Festus finished speaking and leaned back with the ease of a man who believed his performance had landed, Adaeze reached forward and placed the recorder on the table. The room's attention moved to it the way attention always moved to something unexpected, all at once, then calibrating, then very still. She pressed play. The 43 minutes unfolded in a boardroom that had heard many important conversations over the years and had never heard one like this. Not because the content was unprecedented, greed and conspiracy were old stories in rooms like this, but because of the quality of the listening. Every person at that table was hearing themselves forced to choose between the Festus who had just spoken and the Festus on the recording. Between the story of a concerned family member protecting the company and the story of a man who had been routing commission payments through a Wari logistics firm for 7 years while waiting for his brother to die. When the recording reached the 23rd minute and Festus's voice said that woman does not walk away with everything Chitty built, Adaeze did not look at Festus. She looked at Mr. Amadi. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, had become very still. She looked at Dr. Pepple. The woman's pen had stopped moving. She looked at Chief Damanabo, whose expression had not changed but whose eyes had the quality of someone arriving at a conclusion they had suspected for a long time. When Ngozi stopped the recording and the room fell into that particular silence, Adaeze looked at Festus. He was looking at the recorder. Not at her. At the small gray device on the mahogany table. She had a strange thought, he had never known it existed. For 7 years, he had proceeded on the assumption that the evening at Hargrove's dinner had left no trace. He had proceeded on the assumption that his words in private remained private. And they had, until Adaeze had reached into a drawer and shown him the cost of underestimating a woman you had dismissed as a variable. The vote, when it came, was not the dramatic reversal that courtroom stories promised. It was quieter than that. Mr. Amadi voted against Festus's motion with a brief nod that was almost a bow, not to Adaeze but to the evidence itself. Dr. Pepple voted against with the composed directness of someone exercising a faculty she had been trained to trust. The others fell where Adaeze had projected they would fall, and the motion failed 6-2, and the company secretary announced the result in his carefully neutral voice, and it was done. Festus did not explode. She had half expected him to. Instead he was very still, and then he stood slowly, and then he straightened his agbada with a deliberateness that she recognized as a man buying himself the 3 seconds he needed to decide how to leave a room he had expected to own. He picked up his phone from the table. He looked at Adaeze one last time. She held his gaze. Not with triumph. Not with anger. With the steady attention of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment since she was 32 years old and walked into a sitting room full of people who had already decided she was not enough. What she saw in his face in that last moment was not what she had expected. She had expected defiance, the practiced defiance of a man rearranging his pride in real time. Instead she saw something older and smaller. Something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of understanding. Whether Festus would carry it further than this room, she could not know. But it was there. He walked out without speaking. The door closed. Chief Damanabo exhaled slowly and said, as if completing a thought he had been holding for some time, Chitty always said his brother's appetite would outlast his patience. He paused. He was right about that. Mrs. Ekine was already turning to the next item in her folder. Adaeze looked at the window. Port Harcourt was still there, spread in every direction, unmoved by what had just been settled inside this room. The sky had made up its mind about the rain and was beginning to deliver on it, a soft, insistent drumming that Adaeze felt rather than heard from where she sat. She thought of Chitty signing that first lease. She thought of his hand pressing hers under a lunch table 30 years ago. She thought of him saying, "Port Harcourt is the only city in Nigeria where the weather has character." She thought of all the Thursday mornings. She thought of how a life added up, not in the large events but in the accumulation of presences, the years of standing beside something until your hands knew it as well as your own name. "What would you like to do first?" Mrs. Ekine asked. Adaeze turned back to the table. "The quarterly client review," she said. "Let us find out where we are." And they began. The weeks that followed the board meeting were not easy, but they were honest, and honesty had a particular relief after the sustained unreality of the preceding months. Legal processes moved at their own pace, methodical, unglamorous, requiring patience of the kind that Adaeze had spent a lifetime developing. Festus's lawyers sent letters. Ngozi's office answered them with the calm precision of people who held more cards than the other side had anticipated. The investigation into Dixon Obi's appointment opened, moved through its stages, and eventually produced a report that Ngozi described as thorough and damaging, in the particular tone of a lawyer who had fought for evidence and found it. Obi resigned quietly. There was no announcement, no statement, no public acknowledgement of what the investigation had uncovered. He simply sent a letter of resignation to the company secretary and was not heard from again in that context. Adaeze received the news from Ngozi and said nothing beyond, "Thank you for telling me." She had no interest in Obi as a person. She had interest only in the integrity of the board her husband had built. Adaeze Briggs was a different matter. Chitty's cousin had been on the board for 11 years and had known the company in its earlier, hungrier days, had attended the first anniversary dinner, had brought a client or two over the years, had occupied the particular position of family-adjacent support that companies like Briggs Energy often held for relatives who were neither fully inside nor fully outside the business. He had aligned with Festus at the board meeting not, Adaeze believed, from malice but from the old gravity of family loyalty and the assumption that Festus would win. When Festus did not win, Adaeze found himself on the wrong side of a vote with no cover. He reached out through a mutual cousin 3 weeks after the meeting. The message was not an apology, it was not constructed as one, but it contained within it the admission that he had made a misjudgment. Adaeze read it twice and then set it aside. She did not respond immediately. She waited 10 days and then asked the mutual cousin to tell Adaeze that she had received his message and that she had noted it. Nothing more. Adaeze would have to work with that. Some repairs took longer than others, and some were never fully completed, and both possibilities were acceptable. What mattered was that he understood the ground had changed. Obinna came home from London 6 weeks after the board meeting, as planned. He arrived on a Wednesday evening and Mama Benson cooked jollof rice and fried plantain and a pot of oxtail pepper soup, and they sat at the kitchen table, Adaeze, Obinna, and Mama Benson, who did not stand on ceremony about where she belonged, and ate together in the particular warmth of a household finding its new shape. Obinna had questions, good questions, the questions of a son who understood that he was inheriting something real and wanted to understand it properly before touching it. Adaeze answered everything. She held nothing back. She had spent 31 years watching Chitty be transparent with the people he trusted, and she understood now that transparency was itself a form of legacy. He held the original lease document from the first office in Romuald for a long time. Adaeze watched his face as he read it, the date, the signatures, the address. The beginning of a thing that had become his inheritance. He said, "I did not know how much of this you carried." Adaeze looked at her son. She thought about how to answer honestly without making him carry guilt about something that was simply the way the world had been. "I carried it because I chose to," she said finally. "And because it was worth carrying." Obinna looked at her in the particular way adult children sometimes looked at their parents when they understood for the first time that the parent had been a full person long before the child existed. He said, "I want to learn all of it. From you." Adaeze nodded. "Then we will start tomorrow," she said. Amara came for a long weekend in the 3rd month. She arrived from Abuja on a Friday evening looking tired in the way of doctors finishing long rotations and immediately better when she walked through the compound gate and smelled Mama Benson's cooking. She ate 2 full plates and then sat at the kitchen table with her mother and said very little for a while, which was the way Amara processed things she felt deeply, by being present before being verbal. Eventually she said, "I keep thinking about how he would have reacted if he had been here to watch the board meeting." Adaeze considered this. "He would have been uncomfortable," she said. Uncomfortable? He never liked confrontation with Festus. Even when he knew Festus was wrong, he preferred to move around it rather than through it. She paused. "That was one of the few differences between us." Amara looked at her mother with the directness she had inherited from Chitty and the steadiness she had developed on her own. "Do you think he would have been proud?" Adaeze looked at the kitchen, at the table where they had eaten 1,000 dinners, at the window above the sink where the compound's mango tree was visible in the dark, at the familiar arrangement of a room that had witnessed the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a family's life. "I think," she said carefully, "that he would have said, 'I always knew.' And that would have been enough." Amara smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." "Yes," Adaeze agreed. "It does." On the last evening of Amara's visit, after dinner, they went together to Chitty's study. It was the first time Amara had been in the room since the burial. She stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, the same hesitation Adaeze had felt the first time. Then she crossed the threshold and moved slowly through the room, touching things lightly. The paperweight. The framed photograph. The pen beside the notepad. She sat in her father's chair. Adaeze stood by the window and watched her daughter sit in the chair where Chitty had sat and think his thoughts and make his calls and sign his documents and look out at the compound of the life he had built. There was something in the image that was almost unbearable and completely right. "Do you come in here often?" Amara asked. "Sometimes," Adaeze said. "Does it help?" Adaeze thought about it. "It reminds me," she said. "And reminding helps." Amara nodded. She reached for the photograph on the desk, the 2 of them at her graduation, Chitty with his head back, laughing. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it down carefully, exactly where it had been. They left the study together and closed the door behind them. One evening in the 4th month, Adaeze sat alone in the study again. The room had changed slightly in her perception, not in its contents but in its quality. It still smelled faintly of him. It still held the accumulated presence of 31 years of his thinking and his working and his Friday evening cigars. But it had also become, in some measure she could not fully name, her room. She had made decisions here. She had held the recorder here and understood what she would have to do. She had called Ngozi from here. She had thought through every step of the strategy that had ultimately been enough. She opened the bottom drawer. The recorder was still there. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands once more, this small gray thing, unremarkable, the kind of device that sat in drawers for years without being thought of. She thought of the evening she had recorded it. A dinner at Hargrove's Hotel Suite, the kind of elaborate hospitality that oil industry consultants deployed as a business tool. She had been there because Chitty had been there. She had sat with her bag in her lap the way she always did in formal rooms, slightly apart, watchful, the recorder running inside because she had formed a habit, in those years, of recording meetings she did not fully trust. She had forgotten she had turned it on. She had not known until she reviewed it 3 days later what it contained. She had known immediately what it meant. She had also known that she was not yet ready to use it. Chitty was alive. The marriage was intact. Confronting Festus with a recording made secretly at a business dinner would have required a conversation with Chitty first, and that conversation would have damaged something between the brothers that Chitty was not ready to have damaged. So she had placed it in the drawer. She had told herself that perhaps she would never need it. She had been wrong about the never. She had been right about the not yet. She placed the recorder back in the drawer. She closed it. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap in the quiet room, and then she did something she had not done in the study since the burial. She spoke out loud. "I held it," she said softly. "The thing you could not hold. I am sorry it was necessary. But I am not sorry it was done." The room did not answer. Rooms did not answer. But there was a quality to the silence that was not empty, the quality of a space that had been filled over decades with the presence of someone who had loved her and trusted her and held her hand under a table 30 years ago when the room was against her. That quality did not leave with the person. It settled into the walls and the floor and the air, and it remained, and sitting in it, Adaeze understood that this was one of the ways grief eventually changed shape. Not into absence. Into presence of a different kind. She rose. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked to the doorway and looked back once at the dark room, the outline of the desk, the faint gleam of the glass paperweight, the photographs on the wall that she could not see clearly in the dark but knew by heart. Then she walked downstairs toward the sound of Mama Benson moving in the kitchen, toward the smell of something warm being prepared, toward the lit rooms of a compound that was still, despite everything, a home. There is a particular kind of woman who is never counted until the counting can no longer be avoided. She is present in every room but not listed in every record. She signs her name to things and the signature is valid but the name is not remembered. She builds alongside someone and the building carries his name on the wall and hers in the foundation where no one thinks to look. When the time comes to defend what was built, the world expects her to be lost without him. It does not expect her to open a drawer. Adaeze Briggs opened a drawer. And what she found inside it was not a miracle and not a coincidence. It was simply the record of a life paid careful attention to, preserved against the day when the truth would need to walk into a room and take its seat. To every woman who has been building in silence, the foundation is not invisible. It is simply waiting for the right moment to hold the weight. Thank you for watching this story on Zara Tales. If it moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one.